Before we begin tonight's journey into history, I want to ask you something from the heart. If you find peace in these stories, they help you escape the noise of the world and drift into calm, please subscribe to our channel. Every time you subscribe, you help us keep these stories alive. Stories of forgotten lives, lost empires, and moments that shaped the world. Together, we are building a place where history whispers you to sleep. If this brings you comfort, tap subscribe, and let's dream through the past. Together, in the opening years of the 1st century CE, the Roman Empire stood at the height of its power, from the deserts of North Africa to the green fields of Gaul. The eagle standards of the legions stretched further than they ever had before. The Rhine River marked what the Romans believed to be a frontier, but across its waters lay dense forests, rolling hills, and countless tribes whose lives did not bend so easily to Roman order. It was here, in the shadowy woodlands of northern Europe, that Rome would suffer a defeat so shocking that it would echo in whispers for centuries. The Teutoburg's forest was no gentle woodland. It was a vast sprawl of tangled trees, low-lying marshes, and narrow paths that wound unpredictably. Roman soldiers, trained to fight in open fields and march in straight lines along carefully paved roads, found the Germanic wilderness unnerving. The land itself seemed to resist Roman order. Roads turned into muddy tracks, supply carts groaned under the weight of wet soil, and mist clung stubbornly to the ground, even as the sun tried to rise. For the legions who were sent there, the forest was more than geography, was a constant adversary. Soldiers complained of the endless damp that rotted boots and numbed toes. Cooking fires sputtered against the mist. Even the sound of birds seemed muted beneath the weight of the thick canopy. The Germans who lived there knew every path, every clearing, and every marshy patch of ground. The Romans, by contrast, felt like strangers in a hostile world. At the head of this uneasy frontier was Publius Quinctilius Varus, a man of Roman rank and privilege. Varus had been a governor before in Syria, where he was known for strict taxation and a steady hand of Roman authority. But Germania was no Syria. It was not a land of settled cities or predictable revenues. It was a patchwork of tribes with shifting alliances, bound together less by unity and more by a shared distrust of Rome. Still, Varus believed he could bring order here as he had elsewhere. He brought with him 3 full legions and immense force of around 15,000 men, supported by cavalry, auxiliaries, and countless camp followers. The Romans had reasons to believe Germania was pacified. For years, the Germanic chieftain Arminius had served as an ally, even as a commander within Rome's auxiliary forces. He had been raised partly in the Roman world, trained in Roman military practice, and rewarded with Roman citizenship. Too many Roman commanders, he was proof that the tribes could be bent to Rome's ways. He spoke Latin fluently and wore the dress of a Roman officer. His loyalty seemed unquestionable, but in Germania, loyalty was rarely simple. While Arminius had gained honor in Rome, he had also grown in influence among his own people. He understood both sides of the frontier Roman discipline and Germanic freedom, and he knew how to speak to his tribesmen in ways that Varus never could. Where Varus spoke of taxes and Roman order, Arminius spoke of freedom from foreign chains. To the tribes, the legions were not a civilizing force, but an occupying weight pressing down on their traditions. The late summer of the year 09 CE seemed, at first, to be calm. Varus and his legions marched through Germania, enforcing Roman decrees, demanding tribute, and holding court in the name of Augustus, the emperor in Rome. But beneath that surface, calm tension spread quietly. Small disputes between tribes and Roman officials became sparks. Whispers of rebellion traveled along forest paths. Arminius, moving with the ease of a man trusted by both sides, carefully fed these sparks. When word reached Varus that tribes on the far side of the forest were in revolt, Arminius was at his side. He counseled that Rome must respond swiftly, that a show of force would prevent rebellion from spreading. Varus, confident in his ally, agreed. The legions would march through the forest, bringing Roman law with them. To Varus, it was routine. Another march, another assertion of Rome's authority. To Arminius, it was the trap he had prepared for months. The legions set out, heavy with supplies and equipment. The column stretched for miles, a long, winding line of men, horses, wagons, and followers. Each soldier carried arms, armor, and rations, their segmented armor clinking with every step. Roman discipline kept them orderly, even in the difficult terrain, but the forest pressed in on all sides. Narrow paths forced the men into long columns rather than tight formations. Marshy ground slowed the wagons, and rain began to fall in sheets, turning the dirt tracks into streams of mud. Day after day, the march continued deeper into the wilderness. What might have been an inconvenience in Gaul became a slow strangulation in Germania. Soldiers grew weary, their rations damp, their tempers short. Yet Varus pressed on, still trusting in Arminius' guidance. He did not see that his trusted ally had slipped away, riding swiftly into the forest to gather the tribes for the blow that was about to fall. To imagine the tension of those last days is to picture thousands of men surrounded by a silence that was not natural. The forest, normally filled with the rustle of animals and the chatter of birds, grew strangely still. The men noticed, but they said little. Perhaps it was the weather, perhaps just the forest itself, but to the Germans waiting in ambush, it was the sign of the world holding its breath before the strike. The first attacks were sudden, sharp, and confusing. Arrows flew from the trees, striking men who never even saw their attackers. Spears landed among the wagons, spooking horses and overturning supplies. The Romans, used to forming tight shields and lines, could not easily respond. In the narrow paths, their formations broke apart. Officers shouted for order, but the forest swallowed their voices. The rain fell harder, and the ground turned to sludge beneath the soldiers' boots. The legions did not know it yet, but they had marched into a trap from which there would be no escape. The forest itself, the weather, and the cunning of their supposed ally all worked together to turn Rome's finest soldiers into prey. The soldiers must have wondered, in those first moments of chaos, how it had come to this. How had the empire that conquered Gaul, that brought Egypt into its fold, that stood unchallenged across the Mediterranean, been reduced to panic in a German forest? And perhaps, in the silence between the first volleys of arrows, some of them wondered, could the empire itself be broken here, far from the marble temples of Rome? The storm that had begun as a nuisance became a weapon. Heavy rains lashed against the helmets of the legionaries, streaming down their segmented armor until it soaked their tunics beneath. The forest floor, churned by thousands of marching feet, became a sucking mire. Each step demanded effort, each wagon wheel sank deeper, and the horses, unaccustomed to such ground, reared nervously at the scent of blood and the crack of unseen missiles. The Germanic warriors knew this land well. They had waited for the rains, counting on the autumn storms to weaken their enemies. From behind tree trunks and thick underbrush, they hurled javelins and fired arrows before vanishing again into the woods. To the Romans, it was not a battle, but a torment without shape or face. The usual strategies, the testudo, the organized advance. The charge of cavalry had little meaning when enemies refused to meet them in open ground. Still, discipline held. Officers barked orders, shields rose, and men clung to one another as best they could. Varus ordered the column to push forward, hoping to reach open ground where the legions could regroup. Yet every mile only tightened the noose. Supplies spilled from broken wagons. Medical tents, hastily raised in the rain, collapsed before they could serve their purpose. The wounded groaned, left on the sodden earth, while the able-bodied struggled to keep moving. Arminius had vanished entirely from Roman sight. Had been at Varus' side just days earlier, advising a swift march, but now he rode among his tribesmen, rallying them with the cry that the Romans were finally vulnerable. For years, the Germans had endured Roman demands for tribute, the presence of garrisons, the arrogance of governors who believed they could dictate tribal affairs from distant stone fortresses. Now, for the first time, the tribes were united by more than temporary alliances. They were united by the prospect of annihilating Rome's invading force, asterisk. On the second day, the ambush became unrelenting. Warriors struck at the flanks of the marching column, vanishing when the Romans tried to give chase. Men stumbled into pits, dug in advance, their legs shredded by sharpened stakes concealed under mud and leaves. Cavalry units tried to break free of the tree line, only to be met with rolling logs and volleys of spears from higher ground. Each attempt at order dissolved into chaos. The rain did not stop, blurred vision, muffled sound, and extinguished the few fires the Romans dared to light. Food supplies grew sodden, bread turning to paste, grain swelling uselessly in its sacks. Hunger gnawed at the men, even as fatigue set in. Armor, normally a point of pride, became a burden. The iron bands of the larica segmentata, cut into shoulders, made tender by days of strain, blisters formed beneath wet boots. Legionaries, who once marched in perfect rhythm, now dragged their feet like prisoners. Varus himself began to despair. Reports came to him from all sides: officers slain, cohorts separated, entire baggage trains abandoned. Each night he tried to gather his remaining officers, poring over maps that no longer mattered. For the roads marked on parchment bore little resemblance to the muddy trails they staggered along. His hope was to break through the forest and reach the safety of a Roman garrison by the Rhine. Yet, with each passing day, that hope thinned like smoke in the storm. Among the soldiers, murmurs spread. Some cursed Arminius by name, others cursed Varus for trusting him. Still others said nothing, their faces blank with the shock of unending assault. They had fought in Gaul, in Hispania, in the East, but never had they faced an enemy who struck and vanished like ghosts. It was not a war of set-piece battles, but of constant bleeding, and Rome's strength was bleeding away with every hour. On the third day, the losses mounted beyond recovery. Cohorts became scattered fragments. A century of men might collapse into 20 survivors. The wounded slowed the march, yet abandoning them gnawed at the discipline that was Rome's backbone. Rain-slicked bodies lay along the path, armor half buried in mud, their lifeless eyes staring upward through the mist. The column had become a moving graveyard. Some officers proposed building a fortified camp to wait out the storm and regroup, but the ground was too waterlogged, the men too exhausted, the enemy too persistent. Any fortifications they tried to raise by night were smashed by Germanic assaults before dawn. Fires were set against them, and in the choking smoke soldiers were cut down in confusion. The tribes, meanwhile, seemed tireless. For them, every Roman death was a triumph, every abandoned supply a prize. Women and children followed the warriors, gathering what the Romans left behind: tools, cloaks, food, even pieces of armor, pried from corpses. To the Germans, it was as though the forest itself had delivered Rome into their hands. By the fourth day, Varus' authority cracked. He saw that his legions were no longer legions, but scattered remnants. Horses were gone, wagons destroyed, eagles, those proud symbols of Roman might, were captured or buried in the mud. To lose an eagle was the deepest dishonor a legion could suffer, a wound not just to soldiers, but to the empire itself. Yet in Teutoburg, 3 of them were at risk of vanishing forever. The realization struck Varus with a force greater than any spear. He had led tens of thousands of men into the forest, and now he had nothing to offer them but despair. His choices dwindled: to press forward into the tightening jaws of ambush, or to attempt a retreat that was no less dangerous. Both meant destruction. Surrounded by death, betrayed by the man he had trusted most, he saw no path left. As the rain poured and the forest rang with the cries of warriors, Varus made the decision that history would not forget. Unable to bear the humiliation of capture, unwilling to be paraded as a trophy in the hands of his enemies, he took his own life. With him fell the last fragile thread of command. The legions, now leaderless, broke apart completely. Some men tried to flee into the woods, where they were hunted down. Others huddled together, shields raised, waiting for the next attack. A few were taken alive, dragged into captivity that would last for years. The forest, once just an obstacle, became a tomb, and yet, amidst the collapse, one question hung in the air like the mist itself. Could any of these men escape to tell the tale, to warn Rome of what had happened in the depths of Germania? Asterisk. The morning after Varus' death brought no relief. The rain had eased, but the forest was heavy with smoke from smoldering fires. What remained of the Roman legions was scattered and broken. No standards rose above the trees. No order held the men together. The discipline that had carried Rome across continents dissolved in the sodden mud of Germania. The Germans pressed their advantage. They had waited for this moment, knowing the enemy was leaderless, hungry, and exhausted. Warriors emerged from the undergrowth in greater numbers than before, no longer sniping from a distance, but striking openly. They wielded spears, clubs, and swords with the fury of men defending their homeland. The Romans resisted where they could, forming tight circles of shields. Their formations were quickly smashed apart. The forest floor became a graveyard. Men fell into the marshes and were swallowed whole by the mud. Others stumbled over fallen comrades, their cries drowned out by the clash of iron and the roar of tribesmen. The legionaries, who once marched with precision through Gaul and along the roads of Italy, now fought desperately in isolations, small groups hemmed in by trees and swarms of warriors. A few survivors attempted to flee, breaking away from the chaos in the hope of reaching the Rhine. But the Germans had anticipated this. Narrow trails were blocked, bridges destroyed, and fleeing soldiers found themselves funneled into killing grounds where volleys of spears ended their escape. To run was as fatal as to stand and fight. By the 5th day, it was no longer a battle, but a slaughter. The Germanic tribes showed little mercy. Some Romans were cut down where they stood, others captured for grim fates. Prisoners were dragged back to tribal settlements, where some would be enslaved, others sacrificed to the gods in rituals of victory. Roman armor was stripped from corpses and paraded as trophies. Captured eagles, the sacred standards of the legions, were raised high, proof that the might of Rome could be broken. For the survivors, captivity was a torment of its own. Roman accounts tell us that many were enslaved for years, their names fading into obscurity as they labored in foreign villages. Others were subjected to ritual killings, their deaths offered to Germanic gods as symbols of liberation. In Rome's eyes, these were dishonors worse than death itself. To die on the battlefield was expected. To live on as a slave or sacrifice in a barbarian land was to be erased from honor entirely. Far away in Rome, the news did not arrive swiftly. Weeks later, word finally reached the capital of what had happened in the Teutoburg forest. The reports stunned Augustus, the emperor who had crafted Rome into an empire of order and peace after decades of civil war. According to ancient sources, Augustus tore his clothes in grief and cried out in despair, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." It was not just the loss of soldiers, but the loss of Roman pride. 3 entire legions had been obliterated, their standards taken, their names disgraced. The defeat at Teutoburg reshaped Roman policy. Never again would Rome attempt to conquer the Germanic lands east of the Rhine in the same way. Instead, the Rhine and Danube became hardened frontiers, lines Rome defended rather than crossed. The empire, which had seemed destined to expand endlessly, now had limits carved in blood and mud. But the memory of Teutoburg lingered. Roman writers returned to it again and again, describing the bones that littered the forest floor for years. Afterward, decades later, Germanicus, the nephew of Tiberius, led punitive expeditions into Germania, gathering the remains of the fallen and burying them in mass graves. Even then, the land seemed haunted. The forest whispered of betrayal, of arrogance, of the cost of underestimating those Rome deemed uncivilized. For the Germanic tribes, Teutoburg became a foundation stone of identity. Arminius was hailed as a liberator, though his later years were troubled by internal rivalries. To his people, he was the man who proved that Rome could bleed. To Rome, he was a traitor. The Roman Empire in the time of Augustus was a machine built on order. Its provinces stretched across continents, each governed by men sent from Rome to impose taxation, law, and the weight of imperial authority. To administer such vast lands required discipline and calculation, yet sometimes those calculations went tragically wrong. Few misjudgments in history were as devastating as that of Publius Quintilius Varus, the governor whose choices led to the annihilation of 3 legions in the Teutoburg forest. Varus was not a reckless adventurer. Born into a noble family, he had risen through the cursus honorum, the traditional ladder of Roman political and military offices. He had served as consul in 13 BCE, a prestigious role that placed him among the most powerful men in Rome. Later, he governed the wealthy province of Syria, where he gained a reputation for stern administration and the heavy imposition of Roman law. Taxes were his domain, and he collected them with rigor. When Augustus needed a governor for the turbulent frontier of Germania, he turned to Varus. It was not a choice made lightly. The lands east of the Rhine were not yet fully subdued, but Rome believed they could be tamed through administration as much as through conquest. The task required someone who would bring the authority of Rome to bear, someone who would enforce order where chaos reigned. Varus, with his stern reputation, seemed the man for the job, but the frontier was not like Syria. Germania was no land of cities and palaces, no province filled with established elites who could be co-opted into Roman governance. It was a land of tribes, each fiercely independent, their loyalties shifting with circumstance, while Rome thought in terms of provinces and taxation. The Germans thought in terms of kinship and survival. A chieftain might ally with Rome one year and betray it the next if it suited the interests of his people. Varus approached the province with the same mindset he had applied in the east, by imposing Roman law, demanding tribute, and judging disputes, as though he were presiding over a Roman forum. He established courts where Germanic tribesmen were expected to present themselves, and he issued rulings as though his authority were unquestioned. To the Romans, this was civilization. To Germans, it was arrogance. Many could not understand why distant Rome believed it had the right to settle disputes between their clans. Others resented the taxes and levies, which felt less like the price of order and more like the theft of their livelihoods. Where Roman commanders like Tiberius had relied on military presence and cautious diplomacy, Varus pressed for Romanization. He assumed the tribes were ready to become subjects of Rome, ready to be molded into provinces like Gaul or Hispania. He did not see the simmering resentment beneath the surface, nor did he recognize how deeply the imposition of Roman legal codes cut against Germanic traditions of independence. The discontent might have smoldered quietly for years, if not for the figure of Arminius. Trusted by Rome as an auxiliary commander, Arminius had fought alongside Roman soldiers and earned citizenship. To Verus, he seemed a loyal ally, a man who could interpret between the Roman world and the tribal world. But Arminius was not merely an interpreter. He was a strategist who saw Rome's overconfidence for what it was. He watched as Verus imposed law after law, levy after levy, and he knew the time was ripe. Here lay Verus' greatest miscalculation. He believed Arminius' loyalty was secure. He mistook familiarity for trustworthiness. He believed the man who spoke Latin and dined in Roman fashion was a Roman at heart. But Arminius was also a chieftain's son, bound to his people in ways Verus did not grasp. His Roman service had taught him not loyalty but opportunity. He knew Roman discipline, Roman arrogance, and Roman blind spots. He knew how to use them. When whispers of rebellion reached Verus, Arminius was there to counsel him. The tribes were restless, Arminius warned, and a show of Roman force would suppress the trouble before it spread. The governor agreed. He summoned 3 legions, 17th, 18th, and 19th, and prepared to march through the thick forests to bring order once more. This was no small force. Each legion consisted of thousands of soldiers, supported by cavalry and auxiliaries. Their columns stretched 4 miles, burdened by supply wagons and camp followers. It was the very symbol of Roman strength, orderly, disciplined, seemingly unstoppable. Verus believed that with such a display of power, no rebellion could possibly succeed. Yet every decision he made tightened the trap Arminius had prepared. By trusting his supposed ally, by underestimating the hostility of the land, by assuming the tribes were ready to be ruled as subjects, Verus led his men into disaster. He saw the forest not as a weapon, but as an obstacle to be endured. He believed order would carry the day, but the forest had no use for order. As the column wound its way into the dense, rain-soaked paths of Teutoburg, the Romans were not simply marching, they were being drawn step by step into the jaws of betrayal. Verus' miscalculation was no single moment of error, but a chain of decisions, each rooted in arrogance, each bound by the belief that Rome could not be broken. And yet, as history would soon prove, even the empire that had conquered the Mediterranean could bleed in the northern forests. Was it inevitable that Verus would trust too much? Or could a wiser governor, one less certain of Rome's invincibility, have seen the danger in time? To understand the depth of Verus' failure, one must see how he governed Germania, not as it was, but as he imagined it to be. He believed the region could be treated like any other Roman province, a place where Roman law and taxation could be laid down like paving stones across the mud. Yet, Germania was not paved. It was wild, tangled, and rooted in traditions that stretched back generations. Verus arrived with the authority of Augustus himself behind him. In his mind, this gave him the right to extend Roman law into every corner of the land. He established judicial courts where he sat in judgment, deciding disputes between tribes. Roman procedure was elaborate. Petitions were heard, evidence weighed, verdicts announced in the name of Rome. To a Roman audience, it was civilization. But to the Germanic tribes, it was humiliation. To have their disputes settled not by their own chieftains, but by a distant governor, felt like an intrusion into the very heart of their identity. The taxes imposed by Verus were just as resented. Roman taxation was precise and relentless. Villages were expected to give tribute in grain, livestock, and labor. Local leaders were pressed to hand over hostages as guarantees of loyalty. For tribes accustomed to independence, These demands were not seen as part of a fair exchange, but as the bleeding of their strength, where Rome saw the natural order of empire. The tribes saw only extortion. Arminius watched all of this with a keen eye. To the Romans, he was a loyal intermediary, smoothing over disputes and urging compliance. But in private, among his fellow tribesmen, he spoke differently. He described the insult of being judged like children by Roman magistrates. He warned of the endless drain of tribute that would leave their villages weak. He told them that Rome did not come to share power, but to swallow it whole. In him, Case found a voice that could unite their resentment. Various officers occasionally sensed that all was not well. Some warned him that the tribes were restless, that his policies were breeding anger rather than compliance. But Varus dismissed these concerns. He believed that Roman authority was unshakable. The legions, after all, had conquered Gaul under Julius Caesar, marched into Egypt, and stood unbroken across the Mediterranean. How could scattered tribes in a forest pose any real danger? Here lay his second great miscalculation. He underestimated the land itself. Roman armies thrived in open ground, where formations could be kept tight, where cavalry could charge, where discipline could overwhelm disorder. But Germania offered little of this. The forests were thick, the marshes wide, the weather unpredictable. Roads were few and often treacherous. A Roman column, stretching for miles with its wagons and followers, was slow and vulnerable. For men who knew the terrain, every hill and path was an advantage, every bog a trap. Arminius understood this perfectly, had seen Roman tactics in battle and admired their strength in the right conditions. He knew they were nearly unbeatable in the open, so he made sure never to give them the open ground they needed. His plan relied on patience, deception, and timing. He fed Varus information about rebellions that supposedly threatened the frontier. He insisted that a show of Roman strength would deter the unrest. Varus, blind to the manipulation, agreed. When the legions set out, their morale was already strained. The march was long, the terrain unforgiving, and the autumn rains had begun. Yet Varus insisted on bringing not only soldiers, but also their full baggage trains, as though he were moving through a pacified province rather than hostile territory. Wagons creaked under the weight of supplies, herds of animals slowed the line, and camp followers dragged themselves along in the mud. The column stretched so far that if the front were attacked, the rear might not even know until hours later. Officers who had doubts remained silent, for Varus' authority was absolute. He believed he was quelling rebellion. In truth, he was delivering his men into an ambush. Arminius rode ahead, promising to rally allies to Rome's side. Instead, he disappeared into the woods, gathering warriors from tribe after tribe. They had long quarreled with one another, but now they united under his call to destroy the invader before he could destroy them. Still, Varus pressed on. Reports of unrest were treated as confirmation that he was right, not warnings that he was wrong. Every sign of danger, the unease of soldiers, the worsening weather, the endless forests was brushed aside. His faith in Rome's invincibility was unshaken, but faith was not enough. Step by step, mile by mile, The trap closed. Roman shields grew heavier in the rain. Boots sucked at the mud. The wagons sank deeper into the mire. When the first spears flew from the trees, it was not simply an attack on the legions. It was the culmination of every miscalculation Varus had made. His belief in Roman law over tribal custom. His trust in a man who never truly served him. His failure to understand the land he marched through. The governor who had once ruled in Syria with iron control now found himself in a place where his authority meant nothing. His courts, his taxes, his decrees, all of them vanished in the mist of Teutoburg. What remained was only the question of survival, and as the storm fell heavier, another question loomed over the broken column. Could Varus still salvage anything from this disaster, or had his miscalculations already sealed the fate of every man who followed him? Asterisk, the disaster in the Teutoburg forest was not a single moment of collapse, but a slow unraveling of authority, as one thread after another slipped through Varus' fingers. By the third and fourth days of the ambush, his miscalculations had hardened into inevitability. No matter what orders he gave, no matter how many times he called for discipline, the forest swallowed his commands just as it swallowed his soldiers. The Roman legions, trained for order and formation, were forced to fight in fragments. Cohorts that once marched shoulder to shoulder now became scattered clusters of men, pressed against trees, their shields barely raised in time before another spear volley rained down from unseen hands. Officers tried to rally their sentries, but their voices were lost in the roar of wind and the hiss of rain. Some were cut down before their words reached half their men. Varus himself was surrounded by his closest staff officers, and a few cohorts that clung to him as though his presence alone might still anchor them. Yet in his eyes there was little of the confidence he had once carried. He had trusted too much in Roman power, in Roman law, in the illusion that provinces could be carved out of forests simply by decree. Now he saw the truth. The legions were not conquering Germania. They were being consumed by it. The reports that reached him grew worse each hour. An eagle standard was lost, seized by tribesmen, and lifted high as a symbol of Roman defeat. Supply wagons, already mired in mud, were set aflame. Whole cohorts disappeared into the mist, never to return. Officers who tried to break through with cavalry found their horses stumbling and falling, trapped by wooden obstacles in pits prepared long before. By the fourth night, Varus held a council. The faces around him were gaunt, eyes hollowed by fatigue and disbelief. They spoke of building a camp, of retreating, of pressing on, but each plan seemed futile. The men were too exhausted to dig trenches or raise palisades. The ground itself was against them, waterlogged and soft, refusing to bear fortifications. Retreat meant moving back through the same choking paths, already littered with corpses. To press forward meant plunging deeper into the forest where the enemy waited in greater numbers. It was in this despair that Varus made his final miscalculation, or perhaps it was no miscalculation at all, but the only choice he felt remained. Rather than endure the humiliation of capture, rather than be paraded in chains before Germanic chieftains or, worse, before Augustus himself, if Ransom T chose to end his own life, ancient accounts tell us that he fell on a sword. The ultimate act of a Roman governor who believed death was preferable to disgrace his officers. Following his example, did the same. For them, suicide was not simply surrender, but an attempt to salvage a shred of dignity from catastrophe. If they could not bring their legions home, at least they could deny the enemy the triumph of their humiliation. Yet for the soldiers who remained, Varus' death was not a gesture of honor, but a signal of abandonment. Leaderless, scattered, and broken, they faced the final onslaught alone. The Germanic tribes pressed in without mercy. Some legionaries were cut down to the last man, their shields splintered, their bodies left to rot in the mud. were captured, dragged into captivity that would last for years. To Rome, captivity was almost worse than death. Soldiers enslaved, mocked, or even sacrificed to foreign gods. Their fates erased from the honor of the legion. News of the disaster traveled slowly back to Rome, but when it came, it struck like thunder. Augustus, the emperor who had built the empire into a colossus, was said to have torn his clothes in anguish. Suetonius records his famous cry, Quinctilius Varus, "Give me back my legions." It was more than grief for the dead. It was the realization that Rome itself had limits, that even its mightiest legions could be shattered, that its governors could be deceived, that the forests of Germania would never yield to Roman order. The names of the 17th, 18th, and 19th legions were never used again. They were struck from the rolls, as though Rome itself wished to erase the memory of their annihilation. The standards lost in Teutoburg became symbols of shame. Their recovery decades later by Germanicus celebrated with almost religious fervor. But the stain of Varus' failure could not be washed away for the Germanic tribes. Varus' death was the climax of their triumph. For Rome, it was a scar, a reminder that even the most powerful empire in the world was vulnerable to arrogance and miscalculation. Varus had not been a reckless commander in search of glory. He had been an administrator, a governor, a man who believed too deeply in the inevitability of Rome. And it was precisely that belief which destroyed him in the end. Varus was remembered, not for his years of service, not for his role as consul, not for his governance in Syria. He was remembered for one thing only, the man who led 3 legions to their deaths in the German forest. His name became synonymous with disaster, his career overshadowed entirely by a single defeat. And so, history leaves us with the haunting question: was Varus doomed from the start, blinded by Roman arrogance, or was his downfall the result of trusting too deeply in a man who had never truly been Rome's ally? Asterisk among the countless figures who crossed the Roman frontier during the empire's long history. Few stand out as sharply as Arminius. To the Romans, he was at first a trusted ally, a commander of auxiliary forces, even a citizen within the empire's fold. To his own people, he would later become a liberator, the man who struck the heaviest blow Rome ever suffered in the north. His life was a study in duplicity, one where loyalty and betrayal intertwined so closely that for years Rome did not realize how completely it had been deceived. Arminius was no wild chieftain raised entirely in the forests of Germania. He spent much of his youth under Roman tutelage, perhaps even in the city of Rome itself, as part of the policy of fostering hostages from allied or subdued tribes. He was taken into the Roman world, where he learned the language, absorbed the culture, and trained in the Roman art of war. He marched with Roman armies, wore Roman armor, and fought in Rome's battles. By his 20s, he was not just an auxiliary officer, he was also a Roman citizen, and even a knight of the equestrian order. Few among the Germanic elite had risen so far within the structures of the empire. This Roman education gave him more than prestige. It gave him knowledge, how the legions moved, how they camped, how they relied on their strict formations, how vulnerable they became when those formations were broken. He knew, too, the arrogance of Roman governors, who believed their law was superior to any custom, their discipline invincible in any terrain. Arminius saw not just Rome's strength, but also its blind spots. When he returned to Germania as an auxiliary commander, he seemed the perfect bridge between worlds. To Varus and the Roman officers, he was indispensable. He could negotiate with tribal leaders, interpret their disputes, and assure the governor that the frontier was secure. To the Germans, however, he was something different. He was their kinsman, who had seen the might of Rome from within. He could describe its power, yes, but also its limits. Arminius' dual identity gave him an authority neither side fully grasped. The Romans trusted him because he looked and spoke like one of them. The Germans trusted him because he returned to them with warnings about the future, that Rome would not stop at taxes and courts, that soon their independence would vanish entirely. He reminded them that what Rome called alliance was in truth subjugation, that what it called law was nothing more than foreign domination. The discontent among the tribes was real. Varus' imposition of Roman justice had undermined the authority of local chieftains. His taxes drained their resources. His arrogance, born of the belief that Rome could not be challenged, rankled those who had lived freely for generations. Arminius fed this discontent carefully, not in fiery outbursts, but in quiet, convincing tones. He assured his people that Rome was not invincible, that if they struck at the right moment on the right ground, even legions could fall. The key, he knew, was deception. He could not meet Rome in open battle. That would be suicide. He could not gather an army openly that would invite destruction before they were ready. Instead, he played the role of loyal ally. At Varus' side, he nodded gravely when rebellions were discussed, advised caution in dealing with tribes, and assured the governor that Rome's authority was firm. Yet all the while he whispered among the Germans that their chance was near. The opportunity came in the autumn of the year 09 CE. Reports reached Varus of unrest among tribes to the east. Villages refused tribute. Leaders muttered against Roman courts. It was nothing unusual. Frontiers always simmered with low-level resistance. But Arminius insisted that this unrest was dangerous, that if it spread, the whole frontier could ignite. He urged Varus to march with his legions to show the power of Rome and extinguish the flames before they grew. Varus agreed. It seemed a prudent move, the kind of firm response expected of a governor. He summoned 3 legions, their auxiliaries, their cavalry, and their baggage trains. More than 15,000 men in total set out under his command. The line stretched 4 miles, heavy with wagons, families, servants, and all the weight of Rome's military machine. Arminius rode with them, calm and convincing. He guided them through the forest paths, spoke of rebellious tribes ahead, and promised to rally local allies in support. He asked permission to ride ahead and secure their loyalty, and Varus granted it without hesitation. To Varus, it was a sign of Arminius' devotion. To Arminius, it was the final step in drawing the legions into his trap. For while the Romans trudged deeper into the sodden wilderness, Arminius gathered warriors in secret clearings. From tribe after tribe they came, men hardened by years of resisting Roman tribute, men who knew every marsh and ridge of the Teutoburg. Under Arminius' command, they prepared the ambush, trenches dug along narrow paths, barricades of logs ready to be toppled, pits filled with sharpened stakes, roots cut off so no escape would be possible. The plan was simple in its cruelty. Let the Romans march until they were deep within the forest, stretched out, exhausted, their formations broken by the terrain. Then strike, not once, but again and again, from all sides, day after day, until there was nothing left but shattered cohorts and abandoned standards. It was not a battle Arminius prepared. It was a slow death by attrition. It's one that would gnaw at the Roman sense of invincibility until nothing remained. The mists of the forest clung heavy as the legions moved forward. Soldiers muttered about the silence of birds, about the way the rain seemed endless, about how the paths grew narrower each mile. But Varus pressed on, reassured by Arminius' earlier counsel. To him, it was a routine march. To Arminius, it was the moment he had waited for his entire life. When the first volleys of spears came, they came not as a battle cry, but as a whisper of betrayal. Roman soldiers fell without ever seeing their attackers, wagons overturned, horses bolted. Panic rippled through the columns, and somewhere in the mist, Arminius smiled not because the killing had begun, but because Rome had never even realized it was already defeated. The ambush had begun, but was it only Arminius' cunning that sealed Rome's fate, or was it the arrogance of the empire itself that allowed one man to deceive it so completely? Asterisk. The forest became a labyrinth of terror. At first, the Romans believed the attacks to be the work of a few scattered bands raids meant to harass their march rather than destroy it. But Arminius' design was far more deliberate. He had not united the tribes for a skirmish. He had united them to annihilate. The Germanic warriors struck in waves. One moment, the legionaries trudged in weary silence, rain dripping from their helmets, their sandals squelching in mud. The next, spears rained down from unseen hands, hurled from behind tree trunks and thickets. Arrows thudded into shields, armor, and flesh. Before the Romans could reform, the attackers vanished into the mist, their shouts echoing eerily through the trees. Roman training called for discipline in chaos. Centurions barked orders to tighten formations, shields interlocked, spears raised in defense, but the terrain gave them no room to maneuver. The column was stretched too thin, too burdened with wagons and followers. Cohorts were isolated along the winding path, unable to reinforce each other quickly. The cries of the wounded filled the air, and the line slowed further, each delay giving the Germans time to strike again. Arminius had planned it precisely. He knew that panic was a weapon more powerful than any spear. The Romans did not know where their enemy was or how many they faced. Every rustle in the undergrowth could be 100 warriors. Every shadow seemed a threat. In the open plains of Gaul or the fields of Hispania, legionaries thrived on clarity, on the sight of their foe. In the forest, they fought phantoms, and every hour drained their morale. The weather served the Germans as much as the trees. Rain fell relentlessly, soaking cloaks and supplies. The soldiers' bread turned to mush, their rations spoiled. Fires sputtered and died before they could warm the wet and shivering men. The Germans, born to this climate, seemed tireless by contrast. They darted barefoot through the woods, their bodies hardened to the cold and wet, their movements swift, where Roman boots stumbled. Arminius himself did not need to hurl spears or draw his sword in every clash. His true weapon was organization. He coordinated tribes who had often fought one another, convincing them to wait, to strike, not for plunder, but for annihilation. He moved swiftly among the warriors, urging them to hold their ground when greed tempted them to rush forward too soon. He reminded them that if they killed the legions to the last man, Rome's grip on their homeland would be broken for a generation. The Romans began to build temporary camps at night, hoping to rest and regroup. But the ground was sodden, and the walls of earth they raised crumbled under the rain. Key Germanic warriors harassed them even in the dark, sending screams into the night, hurling firebrands at half-built ramparts. Soldiers who tried to sleep awoke to the sound of chaos outside, never knowing if an attack was real or feigned. Varus, who still held overall command, sought to push forward to open ground, believing that if the legions could just reach clear fields, they could reassert their discipline. But Arminius had ensured that every path forward led only deeper into constriction. Trees had been felled to block routes, bridges destroyed, trails deliberately flooded. Each attempt to advance was funneled into ambush after ambush. Day after day, the situation worsened. Horses collapsed from exhaustion, wagons broke down in the mud, and supplies dwindled to nothing. Roman soldiers abandoned what they could not carry, leaving the trail littered with discarded shields, broken armor, and the bodies of the dead. Cohorts lost contact with one another. Okay. And confusion spread as men tried to find their commanders through the choking mist. What must have gone through the minds of those soldiers as they realized the truth? They were not facing a... The climax of the ambush was not sudden. It unfolded like a slow tightening of the forest itself, a suffocation that pressed closer with every hour. By the fourth day of the onslaught, the Romans were no longer marching, but stumbling. Their once proud column had broken into desperate knots of survivors. Discipline had dissolved. Sentries and cohorts that had once moved in precise order now fought as small, terrified bands of men hemmed in by trees and rain. For the Germanic tribes, this was the moment they had prepared for. No longer content with harassing from a distance, they pressed in on all sides. Spears and arrows gave way to close combat. Warriors surged into the Roman remnants, hacking with axes, stabbing with short spears, dragging soldiers into the mud where they drowned under trampling feet. The legions, burdened by heavy armor, slipped and fell in the mire, unable to rise before they were cut down. The ground itself seemed to betray the Romans. Horses collapsed in boggy marshes. Wagons overturned and blocked the narrow paths. Bodies piled where men had tried to form shields against the storm. Armor that had once gleamed in the sun of Syria or Hispania was now dulled by rusting rain. Every plate and rivet heavy as chains on exhausted shoulders. Varus, realizing the inevitability of destruction, had already taken his own life. His death removed the last fragile semblance of order. Without leadership, what remained of the legions became prey. Some soldiers tried to surrender, casting down their weapons, but many found no mercy. Others tried to flee, scattering into the forest in hopes of finding the Rhine, only to be hunted down by swift-footed warriors who knew every tree and trail. The eagles, the sacred standards of the 17th, 18th, and 19th legions, fell one by one. For Rome, the loss of a standard was a humiliation deeper than the death of thousands. To carry the eagle was to carry the honor of the legion itself. Those symbols of Roman eternity were ripped from bloodied hands and raised high by tribesmen who shouted in triumph. For the Germans, these were not just trophies, but proof that Rome, the mighty empire that had claimed to rule the world, could be broken. Ancient sources tell us of the aftermath in grim detail. Captured Romans were paraded through villages, some enslaved, others sacrificed in rituals to the gods of the tribes. Skulls were nailed to trees. Bodies were left unburied, their bones whitening over the years, until decades later, Roman expeditions would find them still scattered among the leaves. To the tribes, it was victory. To Rome, it was horror. Arminius, the architect of the ambush, emerged from the mist not as a Roman officer, but as the liberator of Germania. He had worn Rome's armor, spoken Rome's tongue, and gained Rome's trust. But in the end, he used those very tools to destroy it. His cunning had turned Varus' arrogance into catastrophe, and his deception had shattered 3 legions in the space of days. When news reached Rome, it struck like lightning. Augustus, the emperor who had crafted the empire's golden age, was said to have cried out in anguish, repeating the name of Varus and demanding the return of his lost legions. The empire itself trembled. Never before had 3 legions been annihilated at once. Never before had Rome's invincibility been so thoroughly disproven. And yet, for all his triumph, Arminius' legacy was complicated. In Rome, he was remembered only as a traitor, the man who betrayed his oath of loyalty. In Germania, he became a hero, though even there his later years were troubled by tribal rivalries and betrayals of his own. His victory at Teutoburg proved that Rome could be wounded, but it did not end Rome's presence on the frontier. Punitive campaigns would follow. The empire would strike back. Still, the mist of Teutoburg hung over Rome for generations. The names of the lost legions were never revived. Their numbers were cursed, erased from the rolls of the army. The eagles remained missing for decades, their recovery celebrated as if lost souls had been redeemed. And in the forests of Germania, where Roman bones lay unburied, the land whispered forever of betrayal and destruction. For Arminius, the ambush was the culmination of years of deception, patience, and calculation. But for Rome, it raised an enduring question. How could one man, armed not with legions, but with guile, bring the greatest power of the ancient world to its knees in the rain-soaked woods of the north? The Roman legions were famed across the ancient world for their discipline. From the deserts of Africa to the highlands of Britain, they carried Rome's power in precise ranks of steel. Yet, in the year 09 CE, those same soldiers found themselves dragged into the endless forests of Germania, not in triumph, but in misery. Their story was not of commanders or politics, but of the grinding hardship of men who marched, step by step, steeper into a land that seemed determined to destroy them. For the common legionary, life on campaign was already a heavy burden. Each man carried his equipment on a wooden pole, known as the furca. This included not only weapons, but also tools, stakes for building camps, cooking gear, and rations. Altogether, the load could weigh nearly 30 kilograms on paved Roman roads. In dry climates, this was manageable. But in Germania's autumn rains, the weight doubled in spirit, if not in measure. Sandals slipped in mud, water soaked every cloak and tunic, and each step through the sucking ground dragged at the muscles of weary men. The march through the Teutoburg was not one of quick maneuvers. It was a crawl, wagons bogged down in marshes, forcing men to push with straining backs until their armor cut into their shoulders. Horses slipped and broke legs on slick paths. Camp followers, women and children who trailed the army for survival, struggled to keep pace, clutching infants or pulling carts that lurched and toppled in the mud. The column stretched for miles, a snaking trail of exhaustion hemmed in by trees so thick that daylight barely reached the ground. At first, legionaries kept their spirits with grim humor. They cursed the weather, cursed their commanders, cursed the forest itself. But Roman soldiers were used to hardship, and many believed this march was simply another trial of discipline. They had endured long campaigns before, from scorching deserts to frozen rivers. They assumed the discomfort would pass once they reached their objective. But as days dragged on, the hardships grew heavier. Bread stores spoiled in the damp. Meat rotted before it could be eaten. Fires failed to spark in the downpour, leaving meals cold and stomachs unsettled. Armor, once polished with pride, rusted under the constant rain, joints stiffening until movement itself became labor. Feet blistered and split. The iron nails in their sandals dug into softened flesh. Sleep offered little relief. Camps had to be built each night, even when the men were near collapse. Stakes were driven into sodden ground, trenches dug that filled immediately with water. Soldiers huddled beneath wet cloaks, shivering through the night as the rain pelted down. Every rustle in the darkness sent jolts of fear through exhausted minds. Was it an animal or a German warrior stalking the camp? When the first attacks came, the men were already worn thin. Arrows hissed from the trees, striking comrades without warning. Spears landed in wagons, scattering oxen into chaos. The legionaries tried to form ranks, shields raised, but the forest was too tight, the paths too narrow. Discipline faltered when there was no room to fight. Some men struck out blindly into the trees, only to vanish into the mist. For those who survived the opening assaults, the march became agony. Each mile forward meant more bodies on the roadside, more wagons abandoned, more comrades groaning with wounds they had no strength to bind. The rain washed blood into the mud, until every step felt like treading through graves. Still, the legions pressed on. Centurions shouted themselves hoarse, driving men forward with the old Roman commands. Standards were raised high, the eagles gleaming faintly through the mist, symbols meant to rally courage. But even these became heavy burdens. To carry an eagle was to carry the honor of Rombat in the sucking mud of Teutoburg. That honor felt like a weight dragging men to their deaths. Imagine, for a moment, the view from a soldier's eyes. He sees only the back of the man before him, a shield slick with rain, a sword hilt slippery in his own grasp. His ears are filled with the clash of storm and the sudden cries of comrades struck from nowhere. He knows the column is too long. That help will never arrive in time if the enemy attacks again. He wonders if this march has an end, or if the forest itself is endless, closing tighter until all of them are gone. And always, the questions lingered in their minds. Why had they been led here? Why had they trusted Arminius? Why had Varus believed that law and order could march hand in hand with wagons through a swampy wilderness? The soldiers had no answers, only the certainty that they were being ground down, mile by mile, by a land that did not want them. As the march continued, fatigue turned to despair. Jokes fell silent, faces grew hollow. Each man knew, though few spoke it aloud, that they were not merely marching to put down a rebellion. They were marching toward something far darker toward, a fate that even the strength of Rome might not escape. The long march through the German wilderness had only begun. But already the legions felt the weight of inevitability pressing on their shoulders like the rain itself. And so one question rose in their hearts as the forest closed in tighter. With every step, the second stage of the march was not measured in miles, but in endurance. Each day blurred into the next, marked only by the steady rhythm of exhaustion. The men trudged through mud so deep it sucked at their sandals until straps snapped and feet were left bare against the sharp ground. Armor that once symbolized Roman pride now felt like an anchor, its weight magnified by rain. Legionaries who had once stood tall in gleaming ranks were reduced to bent, staggering figures, their cloaks clinging wetly to their backs, their eyes hollowed by fatigue. Supplies dwindled quickly. The grain that had survived the damp was stretched, thinner and thinner, with men receiving only handfuls to chew raw. Livestock meant to provide meat collapsed in the mire or were driven off by sudden attacks. Foragers sent into the trees often did not return. Some were ambushed, others lost their way in the maze of undergrowth. Even those who made it back carried little handfuls of berries, roots dug from the earth, a rabbit if fortune was kind. It was not enough. Hunger gnawed constantly, adding to the weight of despair. The men's bodies began to break down, cooned, blisters on their feet became open sores. Wet tunics chafed until skin bled. Fever spread among the wounded, their gashes festering in the damp. The Roman army prided itself on medical care, but here in the forest, the doctors had little to offer beyond bandages soaked through within hours. The wounded slowed the march, and though officers ordered them carried, more and more were left behind, lying in the mud as the column passed. The cries of abandoned comrades haunted those still marching. Arminius warriors made certain there was no respite. Day struck at the column's edges, never letting the Romans rest. At one bend in the path, a sudden volley of spears sent oxen into a frenzy, overturning wagons and blocking the way. At another, hidden pits swallowed men who stumbled forward blindly, their screams drowned in the chaos. Cavalry tried to charge the attackers, but found their horses slipping in the muck, skewered before they could build momentum. Each clash was brief, sharp, and merciless. The Germans melted back into the woods before the Romans could mount a true counterattack. The legions tried to build fortified camps at night, as was their tradition, but the ground was sodden, Trenches filled instantly with water and palisades sank into the mud. Fires sputtered and smoked, offering little warmth against the chill. Soldiers huddled together beneath makeshift coverings, shivering as the rain drummed endlessly above. Sleep came only in broken fragments, disturbed by sudden shouts, the howl of wolves, or the eerie war cries of Germans calling from the darkness. Discipline, the spine of Rome's armies, began to fray. Centurions struck men who lagged, but their own voices carried less authority with each passing day. Standards were raised high to rally morale. Yet even the sight of the eagles could not banish the despair creeping into men's hearts. Some whispered of desertion, others of slipping away into the forest to find their own path to the Rhine. Most said nothing, their silence heavier than words. Everywhere the men looked, the forest seemed endless. Trees crowded so closely that, even at midday, the world was dim. The mist clung low to the ground, swallowing vision beyond a few paces. The air reeked of rot, wet bark, and unburied corpses already beginning to decay. Birds had grown silent, replaced by the constant patter of rain and the occasional thud of another spear striking unseen. The legionaries, trained to march in step across open plains, now staggered like ghosts through a realm that seemed to belong to their enemies alone. By the third day, exhaustion turned into resignation. Men no longer cursed the weather, no longer joked or muttered about home. Their faces were blank, their movements mechanical. Each step was simply the next obligation, taken without thought, as though the forest itself had stripped them of will. Varus ordered the men to press onward, insisting that open ground lay ahead. But each mile revealed only more trees, more mud, more ambushes. His officers, who had once inspired confidence, now looked as broken as their soldiers. Some began to doubt openly. Could any force, even Rome's, march through this land and survive? Soldiers must have wondered whether the Rhine their imagined salvations still lay ahead at all. Or was the forest unending, a trap designed not merely to kill them quickly, but to wear them down until they ceased to be soldiers and became only shadows of men? And in the silence between each ambush, as they trudged on, a thought gnawed at every mind. Were they still marching under Roman command? Or had they already become a defeated army, too stubborn to admit it? By the fourth and fifth days of the ambush, the Roman column was no longer a marching army, but a procession of the dying. The forest that had once seemed merely hostile now felt like a living enemy, conspiring with the Germans to grind the legions into the earth. Every tree, every bog, every patch of mist was a trap. And for the soldiers, each step forward felt less like progress and more like surrender to exhaustion. The discipline that had defined Rome's strength was gone. Formations collapsed as men abandoned their units in the chaos. Standards, once symbols of unity, became isolated beacons carried by a handful of survivors who barely understood where their cohorts had gone. When one eagle was lost, the survivors fought with desperation to protect the others, but the ground was against them. Mud pulled down shield walls, rain blinded eyes, and sudden attacks shattered every attempt at cohesion. Hunger hollowed the men. Many had gone days without a true meal. Some chewed strips of leather from their belts. Others gnawed at wet grain that made them sick. The wounded begged for water, but streams and puddles were tainted with filth and blood. Those who stopped to drink were often struck by arrows, their bodies collapsing beside the very water they craved. The cries of the dying echoed constantly. Men fell from exhaustion, their comrades too weak to carry them. Centurions, who once commanded with iron authority, were reduced to pleading with their men to stand, to move, to hold their shields one more time. Some officers fought to the last. Others slipped away into the forest, hoping against hope to reach safety alone. Yet, Safety was an illusion. The Germans hunted every straggler, tracking them as surely as hounds followed scent. For the soldiers, who remained in groups, the fighting became intimate and brutal. No open field clashes, no elegant maneuvers, just stabbing in the dark, scrappling in the mud, killing or being killed at arm's length. Legionaries found themselves dragged down by men in furs, axes hacking at their limbs. Their heavy armor, once their greatest protection, now weighed them down until they could no longer rise. The screams of comrades mingled with the guttural war cries of tribesmen, a sound that drove despair deeper into weary hearts. Some survivors tried to fortify positions, using wagons as barricades or felling trees to form crude defenses. But each attempt ended the same. Firebrands were hurled, smoke rose in choking clouds, and the barricades were torn apart. The Germans attacked in relentless waves, retreating only to regroup and strike again. For them, there was no rush. Time itself was their ally. Every hour wore the Romans thinner, until even resistance became little more than reflex. The weather, as if conspiring with the tribes, refused to relent. Rain poured without end, washing blood into streams that trickled through the camps. Cloaks and blankets never dried. Men huddled together for warmth, their breaths steaming in the cold night, but sleep never came. Fear kept their eyes wide, ears straining for the next sudden cry. When dawn came, it brought no relief, only another day of stumbling through mire under an unseen enemy's gaze. At last, for many, despair broke the final bond of discipline. Some threw down their shields and weapons, collapsing in the mud with hollow eyes, waiting for the inevitable. Others fled blindly into the forest, their sandals tearing on roots, their armor discarded in desperation. Most were hunted down within hours. A few slipped further, surviving 4 days before hunger, exposure, or an arrow ended their flight. And then there were those taken alive. They were bound and dragged back to tribal settlements, where their futures diverged in grim ways. Some became slaves, forced to serve the very people they had been sent to subdue. Others were sacrificed to the gods of the tribes, their blood spilled as offerings in rituals of liberation. To the Roman mind, such fates were worse than death, an obliteration of honor and identity. The wilderness claimed the rest. Thousands of bodies lay scattered among the trees, abandoned where they fell. Armor rusted into the soil. Bones sank slowly into the mud. 4 years afterward, travelers and Roman scouts alike would stumble upon grim reminders of the march skulls mounted on stakes, skeletons tangled with shields, fields of bleached remains where entire cohorts had been cut down. The force became a graveyard without boundaries. And what of the soldiers themselves? In their final, to a Roman soldier, the legion was not merely a military unit. It was a brotherhood, a lineage, a living entity that endured through generations of recruits. At the heart of this identity was a single object, the eagle, the aquila, cast in silver or bronze, sometimes gilded in gold. The eagle standard was mounted on a staff and carried into every battle. It embodied the soul of the legion. To lose, it was not just a military setback, but a spiritual wound, a humiliation that scarred Rome itself. Each legion had one eagle. It was carried by a chosen officer, the aquilifer, whose duty was both honor and burden. In battle, the eagle was always raised high, a rallying point for men to fight toward. It was kept in a sacred place, guarded as though it were a god. Sworn oaths were taken upon it. Victories were dedicated to it. The eagle was more than a banner, it was the legion's heart at Teutoburg. 3 such eagles marched with the 17th, 18th, and 19th legions. Each was born with pride, gleaming faintly even in the midst of Germania. For the soldiers, their presence was reassurance. As long as the eagle stood, the legion lived. But as the ambush closed in, those symbols became not shields of morale, but targets. The Germans knew their significance. Arminius knew it most of all. To capture an eagle was to tear the spirit out of the legion. It represented the first eagle was lost when its cohort was cut off on the march, isolated in a narrow stretch of forest, surrounded on all sides. The men fought desperately to protect their standard. The Aquifer, refusing to let it fall into enemy hands, is said to have buried it in the mud before he died. But the Germans, combing the battlefield afterward, found it and raised it high in triumph. To the survivors, watching from a distance, the sight was unbearable. A Roman eagle, the pride of an entire legion, in the hands of the enemy. The second was taken in the chaos of a night assault. As Roman defenses collapsed, the bearer tried to escape with it, rallying a knot of men around him. They cut their way through the press of enemies, struggling through boggy ground, but exhaustion overcame them. Surrounded, they fought to the last. The eagle, torn from the Aquifer's grip, became a trophy held aloft in Germanic hands. Its image, gleaming in the firelight, was greeted with howls of victory. The third eagle fell when Varus himself was gone, and the legions disintegrated into fragments. A few survivors attempted to carry it to safety, staggering through the rain with their last strength, but the forest gave them no escape. They were ambushed and cut down, the eagle wrenched from their grasp. In that moment, the last thread of Roman honor in the forest was severed. To Rome, the loss of all three was almost inconceivable. It was not merely the destruction of 15,000 men, but the dishonor of losing their sacred standards. A Roman imagination, the eagles were living beings, betrayed and enslaved by barbarians. They were more than metal. They were the spirits of the legions, crying out for vengeance. Augustus himself, when he heard the news, is said to have struck his head against the wall in grief, crying out not only for the men, but for the eagles. Quintilius, Varus, give me back my legions. And, unspoken, but equally agonizing there, eagles the Germans, displayed them proudly, parading them in ceremonies, burying them in sacred groves, or dedicating them to their gods. For them, the eagles were proof that Rome's power was not eternal. Here was the evidence, gleaming and undeniable, that the empire could bleed. For decades, the lost standards haunted Roman memory. They became an obsession for Augustus' successors. Campaign after campaign was launched, not only to punish the tribes, but to recover the sacred objects. Germanicus, in the years following, waged relentless expeditions into Germania. He sought not just victory, but redemption. When he recovered one eagle from a defeated tribe, the news was celebrated in Rome with parades as though a legion itself had been restored from the grave. And yet, not all were found quickly. Some lay hidden for years, unearthed only by chance. Their recovery, a reminder that wounds could linger for generations. Even when they were finally returned, the shame of their loss remained etched in Roman history. For the ordinary soldiers at Teutoburg, the sight of the eagle taken was more terrible than death. To fall in battle was an honorable end, but to see the legion's heart stolen was to feel erased. Many must have wondered in their last moments if Rome would even remember them without their eagle to bear witness, and for Rome itself. The question burned long after the forest fell silent. How could the empire that had raised the eagle as a symbol of eternal dominion allow it to fall into the hands of those it had called barbarians? The loss of the 3 eagles in the Teutoburg forest struck Rome like a spiritual wound. To Augustus and the senators in the capital, it was not simply the death of thousands of soldiers, but the theft of Rome's honor itself. The legions were gone, their names cursed and stricken from the rolls, yet their eagles, the sacred embodiment of their spirit, still lived, trapped in the hands of enemies. Until they were recovered, the disaster would never truly be over. The Roman psyche was bound tightly to symbols. For centuries, standards had marked victory and defeat alike. Julius Caesar himself had once written of soldiers throwing themselves into rivers to save standards from drowning. In other battles, men fought to the last breath around their eagles, treating them as if the fate of the world depended on a single pole of wood and bronze. To lose an eagle was not merely a battlefield accident, it was dishonor. A shame so deep that generations afterward would still feel its weight. In the aftermath of Teutoburg, Augustus fell into despair. Suetonius tells us he tore his clothing, refusing to cut his hair or beard for months, crying out, Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions. But perhaps what he also wanted, though he did not say aloud, was their standards. Without them, the legions were not only dead, but spiritually erased. Punitive expeditions were launched almost immediately. Tiberius, the adopted son of Augustus, led armies across the Rhine to reassert Roman authority. Yet his campaigns were cautious, aimed more at stabilizing the frontier than reclaiming lost honor. The forests of Germania still teemed with hostility, and the memory of Varus' disaster hung heavy over every march. The eagles remained beyond reach, hidden in sacred groves or guarded fiercely by tribes who would not easily part with such trophies. It was not until the reign of Tiberius' successor, Germanicus, that Rome truly sought redemption. Germanicus, a nephew of Tiberius, was young, ambitious, and determined to avenge the humiliation of Teutoburg. In 14 CE, just 5 years after the disaster, he led massive expeditions into Germania. His forces numbered in the tens of thousands, supported by fleets along the northern rivers. His goal was not only to punish, but to recover what had been lost. Germanicus pressed deep into enemy territory, burning villages, defeating tribes, and scattering warriors. He sought out the places where the standards were rumored to be kept. Ancient sources tell us that one eagle was recovered during these campaigns, seized from the Bructeri tribe after they were defeated in battle. When it was carried back to Roman lines, the soldiers erupted in celebration. To them, it was as if the dead of Teutoburg had been granted a measure of peace. Another eagle was recovered years later. During the reign of Claudius, around 41 CE, it had been hidden, passed from tribe to tribe, a prize carried for decades. Its return to Rome was met with solemn ceremony. The emperor himself presided, ensuring that the recovered standard was displayed with reverence. Proof that the shame of Teutoburg was slowly being undone. The final eagle was not recovered until 46 CE, nearly 40 years after the ambush. By then, the soldiers who had carried it were long dead, their bones scattered in the German forests. Yet its return was celebrated as though the legions themselves had risen from the grave. With it, Rome could finally claim that the spirits of the 17th, 18th, and 19th had been redeemed, but the shadow of their loss never lifted. The legions were never reconstituted. Their numbers remained retired, a silent acknowledgement of the depth of their destruction. Even as the eagles were displayed again in Roman triumphs, the knowledge that they had once fallen haunted the empire. For the tribes, the capture of the standards had been more than victory, it was a validation of their freedom. To hold Rome's eagle was to declare that they were not slaves to the empire, that they had struck a blow no other people had managed. Even as some were eventually forced to surrender them, the memory of their triumph lived on in Germanic lore. For Rome, the decades-long struggle to recover them was more than military necessity. It was therapy, a slow attempt to heal the scar left by Teutoburg. Every campaign, every triumphal procession that displayed a recovered eagle was meant to remind Romans that honor, once lost, could be restored. And yet, one question remained, whispered in the minds of many. Could any recovery truly erase the fact that the eagles had fallen at all? when the last of the lost eagles was finally recovered in 46 CE. The Roman world treated it not as a mere object of bronze and silver, but as a soul returned from captivity. Nearly 40 years had passed since the Teutoburg forest swallowed 3 entire legions, yet the shadow of that defeat lingered so heavily that the return of the final standard was celebrated like a resurrection in Rome. The standards were received with solemn ceremony. They were paraded through the streets in triumphal processions, not alongside captured kings or exotic treasures, but on their own, as if they themselves were the prize of war. Citizens lined the avenues to glimpse them, cheering with a mixture of relief and reverence. Priests offered sacrifices of thanksgiving. The Senate issued decrees praising the emperors who had restored the honor of the legions. Each recovered eagle was placed in the temple of Mars, Torah, Mars, the Avenger, in the Forum of Augustus. This temple had been built originally to house the standards recovered from the Parthians, another moment when Rome had redeemed its pride through diplomacy and war. To place the Teutoburg eagles, there was to admit that the wound had been as deep as any Rome had ever suffered. The temple became not just a shrine to victory, but a gallery of Rome's lost and found honor, a place where citizens could see with their own eyes the objects for which so much blood had been spilled. Yet, the triumph was bittersweet. The legions themselves, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, were never reconstituted. Their numbers were retired forever, as though the empire itself wished to mark their annihilation in silence. No new recruits would ever carry those designations. The eagles had come home, but the legions they represented had died in the mud of Germania. The memory of their loss persisted in Roman writing. Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius, Dio all recorded the disaster in tones of shock and grief, and later, emperors led campaigns into Germania. They carried with them the ghost of Varus and his legions. Germanicus, in particular, made it a point to visit the old battlefield, where bones still littered the ground, bleaching under the sky. He ordered the remains buried in great mounds, but the earth could not hide the memory. To the soldiers who marched with him, it was as though they were walking among restless spirits, comrades of another age who had been abandoned for decades. For the Germans, the capture of the eagles had been a moment of triumph unlike any other. Arminius, the man who orchestrated the ambush, was celebrated as a liberator, even after his later assassination by rival chieftains. His name endured in Germanic tradition as the one who broke Rome's illusion of invincibility. The eagles they had taken became proof that the empire was not beyond the reach of free tribes. Even when surrendered, their memory was a source of pride. The symbolism extended beyond the battlefield. To Rome, the eagle was not just a bird of prey, but the chosen emblem of Jupiter, the king of the gods. It represented divine sanction of Roman power. To lose one was to suggest that Jupiter himself had turned his face away. To recover it was to restore the bond between Rome and the divine. This is why ceremonies for their return carried such weight, why emperors made them central to their propaganda. And yet, a whisper of doubt remained. If the eagles could fall once, could they not fall again? Rome's spirit could be captured by tribes in the forest. What did that say about the permanence of empire? The recovery of the standards healed the wound on the surface, but beneath it, the scar remained, a reminder that no power, however vast, was immune to miscalculation and betrayal. In the centuries that followed, Teutoburg continued to haunt Rome, even as new victories came and new provinces were added. The image of those 3 lost eagles lingered in the background. They had been recovered, yes, but never forgotten. Their presence in the temple of Mars altar was both a triumph and a caution proof that Rome could redeem its honor. But also that honor could be lost in a single week of rain, mud, and mist. And so the question endures, did the recovery of the eagles truly cleanse Rome of the shame of Teutoburg? Or did the memory of their loss forever remind the empire that even symbols, like empires themselves, can fall? Asterisk, in the late summer of 09 CE, the Roman world seemed secure. Augustus, the first emperor, had reigned for decades. Civil wars were a fading memory. Prosperity spread across the Mediterranean, and the empire's frontiers stretched further than they ever had before. From Egypt to Hispania, from Gaul to Syria, the Pax Romana, the Roman peace was proclaimed as proof of Augustus' genius. Statues showed him serene, marble carved to suggest eternal stability. But far from Rome's polished forms in the dark forests of Germania, his empire was unraveling. 3 legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, had been swallowed by mist and rain, annihilated in the Teutoburg forest. Their commander, Publius Quinctilius Varus, was dead by his own hand. Their eagles were lost. Their bodies lay unburied, scattered across the bogs. And when the news reached Rome, pierced the heart of Augustus himself. The Roman historian Suetonius preserves a memory of the emperor's reaction, and it is one of the most haunting images of his reign. Upon hearing the disaster, Augustus tore his clothes, struck his head against the wall, and cried out, "Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions." It was not the measured grief of a statesman, but the anguished wail of a man who had given his life to building an empire, only to see it shaken by a single catastrophe. To understand the depth of his despair, one must remember what those legions meant. They were not just soldiers stationed on a distant frontier. They were the instruments of Augustus' entire project. The empire had been born out of war. Julius Caesar had conquered Gaul with legions. Augustus himself had seized power in civil war with legions, and the Pax Romana was secured by legions. To lose 3 at once was unthinkable. It was not merely a defeat. It was a wound to the very foundation of Rome's claim to rule the world. The losses were staggering. More than 15,000 men dead or captured, experienced officers gone, standards taken, an entire Roman army obliterated beyond recovery. But the numbers, grim as they were, did not capture the true weight. For Augustus, this was a personal failure, one that struck at the image of invincibility he had so carefully crafted. Rome itself trembled at the news. Panic spread through the city. Rumors flew that Germanic tribes would pour across the Rhine and into Gaul, even into Italy itself. Some feared that Augustus' empire, built with such care, was about to collapse in the north. The Senate, too, was shaken. Senators who had once praised Augustus' wisdom now whispered about the arrogance of pushing into Germania. For the emperor, already in his 70s, must have felt like the work of a lifetime was in danger of unraveling. His reaction was both public and private. Publicly, he ordered new levies of troops. Boys barely of age and veterans long retired were recalled to arms. Inscriptions from the time show emergency measures, scraping together of every available man to reinforce the Rhine. Rome, for all its grandeur, revealed in this moment the fragility beneath the marble dot. Privately, Augustus' grief was raw. Suetonius tells us he would wander his palace, muttering aloud the same cry again and again, "Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions." Daring the hopelessness of the demand revealed the depth of his torment. It was as if he could not accept that Rome, his Rome, had been broken by what he considered barbarians. The emperor's anguish was not only about numbers or symbols, it was about the illusion of control. For decades, Augustus had projected himself as the bringer of stability, the man who had ended chaos and ensured peace. He had reorganized the provinces, reformed the army, and claimed divine favor. Yet now, at the end of his life, he faced a truth that no emperor wished to admit. Rome was not invincible. His marble statues showed him calm, eternal, godlike. But Behind closed doors, the man himself beat his head against the wall, begging for the impossible return of what was lost. And so, in that cry, half prayer, half curse, we glimpsed not only Augustus, the emperor, but Augustus, the man, weary, aging, haunted by defeat that no triumphal arch could ever erase. But here lies the question that echoed through Rome. Was his grief merely for Varus and the legions? Or was it the shattering realization that the empire he had built had limits it could never overcome? The immediate aftermath of Teutoburg was a storm of panic. In Rome, the Senate gathered in anxious debate. Senators asked whether the Germanic tribes, emboldened by victory, might sweep westward across the Rhine, threaten Gaul, and perhaps even march into Italy itself. The loss of 3 legions in a single campaign was unheard of in living memory. Not since the days of Hannibal, more than 2 centuries earlier, had Rome suffered a blow that seemed to imperil the empire itself. Augustus responded with urgency, his anguish now tempered by action. He ordered emergency levies across Italy and the provinces. Veterans who had laid aside their armor were recalled. Boys barely past childhood were conscripted. Even freedmen, men who had once been enslaved, were pressed into service. The urgency of the crisis stripped away the usual boundaries of Roman military recruitment. Every able body was needed. The emperor himself oversaw the organization. His hair, already thinning with age, went uncut. His beard, normally trimmed with care, grew out as a sign of mourning. He wore no wreaths of victory, no symbols of triumph. To the Roman people, it was a visible reminder of the gravity of the loss. Augustus, who had ruled for decades with a calm and almost divine composure, now appeared as a grieving father of the nation. His public sorrow was meant not only to express his own pain, but to bind Rome together in shared determination. Across the Rhine, the situation was dire. Survivors from Teutoburg had fled west, spreading word of the annihilation. Garrisons trembled. Commanders feared rebellion among allied tribes, and Germanic raiders pressed closer to the frontier. Augustus sent Tiberius, his adopted son and most trusted general, to stabilize the situation. Tiberius, a man of caution and discipline, acted quickly. He withdrew Roman forces from overextended positions, strengthened fortifications along the Rhine, and imposed strict defensive measures. His priority was survival, not immediate revenge. The legions stationed in Gaul became the shield of the empire. Camps were reinforced with earthworks, supplies stockpiled, roads repaired for swift communication. Diplomacy was renewed with tribes still willing to side with Rome. The aim was to prevent the disaster from igniting a wider rebellion that could have spread like fire through the frontier. In Rome itself, Augustus wrestled with the political consequences. For decades, his reign had been built on the promise of stability after the chaos of civil war. The defeat in Germania threatened to undermine that promise. Rivals whispered that the emperor had overreached, that his dream of extending Roman control beyond the Rhine had been arrogance. Some suggested abandoning Germania entirely, drawing the empire's line permanently at the river. Augustus did not reject these criticisms outright. He was old, his health failing, and the shock of Teutoburg weighed heavily on him. Yet he refused to let the empire appear weak. In speeches and decrees, he insisted that Rome remained unshaken, that new legions, would restore order, that the gods still favored the empire. He poured resources into rebuilding the army, even at great strain to the treasury. He ordered the names of the destroyed legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, never to be used again. Their numbers were retired, erased from the rolls, as though Rome itself could not bear to see them revived. The public rituals of mourning were matched by rituals of vengeance. Sacrifices were made to Mars, Jupiter, and other gods, calling for justice against those who had desecrated Rome's honor. Statues and altars reminded citizens of the gravity of the moment. The image of Augustus striking his head against the wall, muttering his anguished cry, circulated widely, becoming part of the empire's memory of the event. For the Roman people, the emperor's grief was both terrifying and comforting. Terrifying, because if even Augustus despaired, then perhaps the gods truly had turned against them. Comforting, because his grief was their grief, proof that he felt what they felt. That he was not aloof in his marble palace, but shared the sorrow of the empire. Meanwhile, the forests of Germania, Arminius and his allies celebrated their triumph. Roaming bodies remained unburied, their bones scattered across the earth, their eagles displayed in ceremonies of victory. For them, it was liberation. For Augustus, it was torment. Reports of these desecrations reached Rome, fueling his anguish. To him, the defeat was not just military, but spiritual. Roman order had been swallowed by a barbarian chaos. And yet, Augustus did not order immediate revenge. His grief had made him cautious. The task of recovery would fall to the next generation, to Tiberius, and later to Germanicus. Augustus' role was to steady the empire, to prepare it for the long struggle ahead. Even so, the image of the emperor muttering in despair lingered. At night, in his palace, Augustus was said to cry out the same plea, Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions. A plea not to Varus, who was dead, but to the gods themselves, a demand for the impossible, cry that revealed the fragility beneath the marble calm of empire. And yet, as Augustus tried to calm Rome with new levies and fortifications, one question remained unspoken. Could an empire built on the illusion of invincibility survive the knowledge that it could be broken? Asterisk, the last years of Augustus' life were marked not only by age, but by the weight of memory. He had ruled for more than for decades, transforming Rome from a republic torn by civil war into a vast empire bound together by roads, legions, and law. Yet, for all his triumphs, the disaster in the Teutoburg forest lingered like a wound that never healed. Even after Tiberius stabilized the frontier, even after emergency levies restored the numbers of Rome's armies, Augustus could not forget the annihilation of 3 legions. The figures were clear: more than 15,000 men dead or enslaved, 3 eagles lost, 3 legion numbers struck forever from the rolls. But numbers alone were not what haunted him. It was the image of bones left unburied, of the empire's banners paraded by enemies, of the forest-swallowing order. Whole Roman writers describe him wandering the halls of his palace at night, calling out the same cry again and again, Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions. He said it not to the man who was gone, but to the absent legions themselves, to the gods, perhaps even to the silence of history. It was the sound of a man who had built his life on control, now forced to face the truth that control was an illusion. Augustus was not a commander in the field by this time. Age had left him frail, his body weakened, though his mind remained sharp. He depended increasingly on Tiberius, his adopted son, to manage military matters. Tiberius' caution and discipline reassured him, yet he knew the frontier could never again be trusted as secure. Germania, once imagined as a province to be, was now a permanent threat. The Rhine would mark not a temporary line of advance, but the hard limit of Rome's expansion. This realization marked a turning point in Roman history. Before Teutoburg, expansion seemed inevitable. Gaul had fallen, Egypt had fallen, Hispania had been pacified. Why not Germania? After Teutoburg, the dream of conquering the endless forests was abandoned. Augustus, in his grief, recognized that empire had boundaries. It was a lesson written not in philosophy, but in blood and mud. In his final years, Augustus withdrew more into ceremony and symbolism. He celebrated anniversaries of victories long past, built monuments, and emphasized the stability of Rome's institutions. Yet, beneath the marble, the memory of Teutoburg was never far. Even as triumphal arches were raised and poets praised his reign, whispers of the lost legions echoed in the background. Citizens remembered his cry, repeated in the streets, "Give me back my legions." The loss also affected how Augustus thought of legacy. He had no illusions about immortality. He knew death was near. His body ached with age. His steps slowed. His voice weakened. He spoke often of how he had found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. But marble was not enough. He wanted Rome to endure beyond him, unbroken. Teutoburg had shown how fragile that endurance could be. When Augustus died in 14 CE, he left behind an empire both secure and scarred. Secure because its armies still dominated the Mediterranean, its administration still efficient, its economy still strong. Scarred because the memory of Teutoburg had burned into Rome's collective mind. The 3 legions were gone forever, their names cursed, their standards lost for decades. The defeat became part of the story of Rome itself, a reminder of arrogance, of overreach, of the limits of empire in the centuries that followed. Augustus was remembered as the founder of the Roman peace, the first emperor, the man who brought order to chaos. But alongside those praises, one image lingered, an old man, weary with grief, striking his head against a wall and begging the impossible. His reign had given Rome greatness, but his cry had revealed the human cost of believing greatness could last forever. And so, Augustus' anguish leaves us with a haunting question. Was Teutoburg a tragedy of one man's grief? Or was it the first sign that even the mightiest empire had bound? The Teutoburg force was not merciful. In the days of slaughter, when 3 Roman legions dissolved under rain, mud, and ambush, most men met their deaths in the mire. Some fell in battle, some by their own hands. Others were left broken and unburied beneath the canopy. But not all died. A portion of the survivors, hundreds, perhaps more, were captured alive. For them, survival was not deliverance, but a sentence of years in foreign captivity, where Rome's order could not reach them and where their identities as legionaries dissolved into silence. The Roman mind feared captivity as much as death. To be taken alive by an enemy was to suffer a fate worse than honorable defeat. Enslavement, humiliation, ritual sacrifice. These were outcomes that stripped a man of his dignity. Roman honor demanded that a soldier fight to the end or fall by his own hand rather than live in chains. Yet, in the chaos of Teutoburg, choice was not always possible. Wounded, exhausted, surrounded, many men were seized as prisoners of war. What happened to them is recorded only in fragments, but those fragments tell of lives both miserable and strange. Ancient writers suggest that some were enslaved, absorbed into Germanic households as laborers. A captured legionary might find himself herding cattle, tending fields, cutting wood under the command of the very people he had been sent to conquer. For a man trained to march in discipline, to build camps in geometric precision, to obey the Latin orders of centurions. Cana, this new life must have felt like exile, not only from Rome, but from himself. Others faced darker fates. Counts speak of ritual sacrifices offered to the gods of the tribes. Prisoners were bound, their blood spilled in groves, sacred to deities unknown in Rome's pantheon. To the Germans, these acts were not cruelty, but reverence offerings of victory, symbols that the invaders had been defeated, not only by men, but by the divine will of their gods. For the Romans who died this way, there was no honor in the eyes of their comrades, only a silence that would never be recorded in triumphal inscriptions. Yet not all was despair. Some survivors adapted, finding ways to live among their captives. In tribal society, strength and resilience were valued, and a man who proved himself useful could eventually earn a place, however humble. Stories circulated later of Romans who married into Germanic families, raising children who knew nothing of the empire across the Rhine. To Rome, such men were lost forever. To their children, they were not legionaries, but fathers, absorbed into a new lineage. Decades later, when Germanicus led campaigns into Germania, Roman soldiers stumbled upon the remains of the battlefield. Tacitus tells us they found bones scattered everywhere, skulls nailed to trees, and altars where sacrifices had been made. But they also encountered living Romans, men who had survived in captivity for years. Some were ransomed back to the empire. Others refused to return, either too accustomed to their new lives or too ashamed to face the eyes of comrades after years in chains. Imagine, for a moment, what it meant for one of these forgotten men to see the eagles of Rome again, to hear Latin spoken in commands, to see soldiers in ordered ranks after decades of wandering in a foreign tongue. Some must have wept with relief. Others, perhaps, felt only estrangement. Time changes men, and captivity more than most. They were Roman by birth, but Germania had become their world. To cross back into Rome was to return as strangers to the land they had once served. The survivors of Teutoburg lived not in glory, but in obscurity. Their names were not recorded on monuments, their deeds not celebrated in marble. They were men who endured the unendurable, who lived on in a space between two worlds, neither fully Roman nor fully Germanic. To their fellow citizens, they were reminders of shame. To their captors, reminders of triumph. And yet, their existence poses a question as haunting as any battlefield. Is survival always victory, or can it be its own form of defeat? Asterisk, the men who survived Teutoburg as captives did not find themselves in chains beneath marble arches, paraded in triumph before a Roman crowd. Their captivity was quieter, harsher, and stranger. They were scattered among the tribes that had taken them, absorbed not into prisons, but into households, villages, and fields. For a Roman legionary, trained to measure life by drills, orders, and rations, this was disorienting beyond measure. In Rome's imagination, captivity meant dishonor, but in Germania, captivity meant transformation. A legionary might wake one morning no longer a soldier, but a herdsman. His weapons were gone, replaced by a staff for driving cattle. His armor, once polished and admired, might be melted down into trinkets or buried as spoils. His Latin tongue, spoken among comrades, became useless. Instead, he learned the guttural sounds of his captors. At first awkwardly, then with fluency born of necessity. Some captives were enslaved in the strictest sense, bound to fields and forced to labor. They plowed with primitive tools, tended goats, or felled trees. They slept in huts of wattle and thatch, their rations no better than those of the poorest tribesmen. For men who had once marched under the eagle, it was humiliation. Yet their bodies adapted, their hands hardened, their shoulders bent to new tasks. Others, perhaps younger or stronger, were taken into the households of chiefs. These men sometimes found themselves treated less as slaves than as symbols, trophies of victory. A Roman captive might be displayed at feasts, his presence proof that the mighty empire could be humbled. He might be forced to serve wine or to recount tales of Rome, his words both exotic and confirming of the tribe's triumph. To him, each retelling must have felt like salt on an open wound. A few, however, discovered paths to acceptance. In tribal society, loyalty and usefulness mattered. A Roman who proved himself valuable could gain a measure of status. Some worked as craftsmen, others as interpreters, bridging the gap between Latin and Germanic speech. Over years, bonds formed. A soldier who had lost his comrades might take a wife among the tribes, raising children who knew no other father. These men, when encountered decades later by Roman expeditions, were often reluctant to return. They had found new homes, however alien, and the Rome of their memories had become as distant as a dream. But not all captives were so fortunate. Ancient sources tell us that many were offered as sacrifices. Germanic religion held that victory was owed to the gods, and what greater offering than the blood of Rome's finest? Prisoners were bound, dragged into sacred groves, and slain in rituals of triumph. To the tribes, it was holy. To the Romans, it was barbarism beyond comprehension. Those who escaped this fate lived under its shadow, never knowing when they might be chosen next time was the greatest enemy. The days bled into one another. Cold mornings, harsh labor, unfamiliar food, the constant ache of longing. Some captives held on to fragments of identity. They whispered Latin prayers before sleep, scratched marks into wood to count the passing seasons, or clutched tiny tokens hidden from their captors. Others surrendered to the years, letting their Roman selves fade. Their backs bent, their voices took on new accents. Their memories of the legions blurred when Germanicus led punitive campaigns into Germania 2 decades later. Roman soldiers found traces of these forgotten men. Tacitus writes of encounters with survivors who had grown old in captivity. Some fell at their comrades' feet, weeping to see the eagles of Rome again. Others turned away, unwilling to abandon the families they had made in their years of exile. The empire called them lost, but in truth, they had lived a second life in a foreign land. The survival of these men was not glorious. No triumphal arches bore their names. No poets sang of their endurance. They were reminders of defeat, of the limits of empire. To Rome, they embodied shame. To the tribes, they embodied victory. Yet to themselves, perhaps, they embodied something quieter, the stubborn persistence of life, even when everything else had been stripped away. And so, the question lingers. For the survivors of Teutoburg, was captivity a mercy, or was it simply another form of death, stretched across years instead of days? Asterisk, when Roman armies returned to Germania in the years after Teutoburg, they came not only seeking vengeance, but also traces of what had been lost. Germanicus, commanding vast forces between 14 and 16 CE, marched deep into the forests where Varus' legions had perished. His soldiers buried bones that still lay scattered across the ground, erected mounds to honor the dead, and reclaimed one of the eagles from the tribes. But among the most haunting discoveries were not bones or relics, but living men, survivors who had endured 2 decades in captivity. Asterisk. Tacitus records that when Germanicus soldiers came upon them, some of these men burst into tears. They saw the eagle standards once more, gleaming above ranks of disciplined legionaries, and it was as though Ghosts had returned to life, gray-haired, scarred, their bodies worn by years of labor. They knelt in the mud before the banners they had once followed in youth. To them, Rome had returned like a vision. For a moment, they were soldiers again, not captives. Yet, not all reacted with joy. Some turned away. They had been too long in Germania, had taken wives, fathered children, tilled fields that were now their homes. To follow the Romans back across the Rhine meant abandoning the only lives they had left. Others were ashamed. To stand among comrades after decades of bondage was to feel the weight of dishonor. The Roman code valued death over captivity, and, though no fault lay with these men, they knew how their survival would be judged. For those who did return, life in Rome was uneasy. They were reminders of a shameful defeat, not of glory. No triumphal arches bore their names. No parades honored their endurance. Instead, they were quietly absorbed into the shadows. Their fates unrecorded, their voices silent in the grand story of empire. Rome preferred to remember its vengeance, not its survivors. The narrative of Germanicus' campaigns emphasized recovered standards, burned villages, and avenged honor. The men who had endured decades in huts and fields were inconvenient footnotes, reminders that Rome had once been humbled, and yet their existence whispered truths the empire preferred to ignore. They revealed that Roman discipline could be broken, that Roman men could live as dependents in foreign households. That empire was not as eternal as its monuments claimed. 2 Roman commanders, they were anomalies. 2 historians, they were fragments. To themselves, they were men who had endured not by glory, but by persistence, surviving long after their legions had vanished from memory. What became of them in the end is uncertain. Some may have melted back into Roman society, nameless veterans, fading into obscurity. Others may have been left in Germania, unwilling or unable to return. Their children, born of Germanic mothers, became part of the tribes, carrying Roman blood into communities that Rome called barbarian. The boundary between empire and wilderness, so sharply drawn on Roman maps, was blurred in the bodies of these forgotten men in later centuries. Roman writers remembered the disaster of Teutoburg with horror, but rarely did they dwell on its survivors. The story of Varus' defeat was one of catastrophe, eagles lost, and vengeance sought. The men who lived on in captivity did not fit the narrative of heroic Rome. They were too human, too ambiguous. They showed survival not as triumph, but as compromise, as endurance without honor, and so they slipped from the record, their names uncarved, their stories unpreserved. We know they existed only because of passing mentions, faint echoes in Tacitus and Cassius Dio. History, which celebrates victories and mourns glorious deaths, had no place for them. Yet their ghost remains, in the silent villages where they labored, in the forests where they raised children, in the Roman camps where they returned as strangers. They carried the weight of memory no monument could contain. They were men who had once marched beneath the eagle and then lived to see it torn from their grasp. Men who endured when all else was lost, but whose survival was remembered by no one. And so we are left with the quietest question of Teutoburg. Were these survivors lucky, or were they the unluckiest of all? Asterisk, the Teutoburg disaster was not won by swords alone. Spears and ambushes struck the Roman legions, but it was the land itself, the rain, the mud, the marshes that made their defeat inevitable. For soldiers trained to march on roads and fight in open fields, the German wilderness was not just unfamiliar, it was hostile, almost alive in its cruelty. The very ground beneath their feet seemed to conspire with the tribes to break them down. Forest was endless, a canopy of oak and beech that shut out the sun. The air hung damp, heavy with the smell of wet leaves and rot. Paths wound unpredictably, narrowing until men marched in single file, shields scraping against trees. Wagons creaked and lurched, wheels sinking into the muck. Horses slipped and balked, their nostrils flaring at scents of blood and smoke. For men used to the